What is CATIA Stimulate and what value does it provide to embedded systems developers? Let's talk about that next. Okay, so we're gonna talk about CATIA Stimulate, but before we jump into that, it's really important that we have some context for embedded systems development. So here's the basics. You instrument a product or a system with sensors. You get readings off of those sensors, it's fed to the control software, and it's processed. And based on that, certain commands are then sent to the physical actuated components in your product, and that in turn should have some interaction with the sensors. So this kind of represents the most fundamental aspects of an embedded system, right? It's a closed loop, and a really good example would be an anti-lock braking system, right? You have sensors that tell you, are we skidding? Is the car skidding? And then you have control software that processes that. And if so, then it actuates your brakes to pump them to help bring the car back to rest. And the sensors are tracking if that is actually the case. So now, what role does CATIA Stimulate play in this process? Let's talk about that. In general, these embedded systems kind of progress through several stages. First, you figure out, okay, what's your logic model? Like, what are the basic if-then statements that would represent the logic of the software that you want to develop? Then you develop the code, you compile it, and then you have physical tests. Now, going from one phase to another in this development process, there typically isn't a lot of carryover. There's a lot of throw it over the wall and recreate stuff. And that can be really, really painful. So for example, like assessing your test log from your product test. I mean, that, debugging it, finding out what's going on, that could take 2 weeks, right? And today's schedules are just so compressed, especially on the software end of things where you don't have real hardware to test for a long time. You don't have the target electronic hardware you want to run on for quite some time because you got to have a prototype. It's often brand new to the world. So that's where there's a lot of pain in this process, and that's what CATIA Stimulate can help address. Fundamentally, what CATIA Stimulate does is it provides stimulus into your control software, and then you can set up what's called observers to actually watch what the commands are that come back out of that software. So there's kind of two components here. It's stimulate or perturbate on the input, basically the sensor readings, and then watching what happens that comes back out of that control software. Now here's what is interesting about CATIA Stimulate. The stimulation or perturbation and the observation capabilities are reusable. You can apply them against a logic model. You can apply them against compiled code. And then, of course, your sensor readings are during a physical test, you're gonna be coming from the actual physical sensor. So you don't need that perturbation. It's real live stuff. But you can have an observer that watches the commands, kind of rides along. And you get to see, as the sensor readings change, here are the commands that are coming out of it. So in each of these phases, these capabilities of CATIA Stimulate help you identify where there are problems and debug it. And all of that is pretty significant. We talked about earlier kind of throwing things over the wall and starting anew in each of these phases. If you're able to reuse capabilities to perturbate or stimulate and then observe, that helps you debug in each phase. And that's sitting there. Once you do it once, you can reuse the same exact thing in each of these other phases. And that accelerates the cycle, lets you identify problems earlier so that you can fix them, right? And that is a big, big part of making sure embedded systems, control systems work properly. So that's the big advantage that comes along with CATIA Stimulate. It's completely different from CATIA Magic, which is their MBSE solution. Completely separate, and it has its own value proposition, and it's a pretty strong one. So that's it. Take care. Talk soon.